Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. This program emanates from KAZU-FM, Pacific Grove, California, and it's broadcast number 687, February the 4th, 1985. I am taking time aside from this week, February, the first week in February, until April the 15th, and I'm not going to be answering mail or telephone calls, so don't get upset and think something's wrong. If you want to write letters, go ahead. And when I get back after that time period and get to the mailbox, I'll answer them. I do want to write, and I can't keep up with what I'm doing and answer the telephone calls and be all things to all people. There's one researcher that wanted to come down from the Bay Area and copy some material about Edwin Meese. My material about Edwin Meese has been available here for the past years, all the time Reagan was governor, also when he was running for president, and up to the present time. And even though he's going to pass the confirmation hearings as part of the Senate Judiciary, there will be a full Senate vote on Edwin Meese, and I think you should write to your senators and express ideas that were not investigated but which are terribly important to the character and the tone of Ronald Reagan and Edwin Meese as a pair. I will be on the air every week, and we'll have the broadcast as usual. They'll go out, and the cassettes will go out. And I'll be at De Anza College March the 7th. It's Women's Week, and I was up there last year and spoke with them, and we got to get to know each other. And it was a very nice experience. That'll be at 7:30 on March the 7th. But if you want to know about it, call the college. Don't call me, okay? People are spoiled because I'm always available, but I just have to stop it. Somebody called me from Puerto Rico today, wanted to know if I'd have a conference call twice a month and talk with him, or would I meet him on a conference basis. I had to say no until the middle of April. I was going to say September. Maybe it'll be that long. Until April, but we'll see. I just need the time to do some work and do some writing, and I've earmarked that time. And before the spring gets full-blown, it's hard to cut yourself off. In the summer, this is a good time to do it. Now, last week I was talking about the book, just brought up the subject of Citizen Hughes by Michael Drosnin, and I'm getting a lot of telephone calls about that. I got the idea now. Again, it gets back. I won't be taking the calls, but I like the suggestion. I will be doing a lot on Howard Hughes. It's one of the most important stories, if not probably second importance to Fritz Kramer, Henry Kissinger, Daniel Graham, and Alexander Haig. That power combined to me is the most important story in the country, and under that is the Hughes organization, because Howard as a person was invisible after 1966 and was drugged out of his head from 57 to 66. But these other people weave in and out of the power structure of Washington and right up to the outer spaces pushing the Star War and the offensive weapons for World War III. Now, this book, Citizen Hughes, was advertised in a 5-part series of the San Francisco Examiner across the whole top of the page in big black letters. First of 5 parts, When Madness Claims the Man in the Pink Bungalow. Now, if the Pink Bungalow man, who's the largest single contractor for the United States government, is crazy, call the doctors, put him in a mental hospital. Who was drugging him? The chief of police of Beverly Hills, Jack Eggers. Who was delivering the drugs? Bobby Hall, who then was murdered, and Eggers was in on the murder and knew the night that he was going to be murdered, and as soon as he was murdered, the gentleman called and said the mission is accomplished. The purpose, I think, of bringing out this book now is to reinforce that old Hughes myth that he was responsible for himself and that his craziness was all on his part and that he was not manipulated by the federal government. Mr. Drosnin wrote formerly for, and probably still does, for the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. The Washington Post, with Bob Woodward, covered up the entire plans for a military coup in 72, the plans to kill Nixon and keep Agnew, his links to the Nazis in Greece, into Europe, into power. They covered up the Louis Tackwood allegations were absolutely true of the links to the Los Angeles Police Department and the original plans to kill Richard Nixon. The Bob Woodward story was a total fraud with touches of truth that you could bank on, so therefore you couldn't distinguish what they left out unless you knew the case very, very well or listened to world watchers all the time that those things were happening and going on. Wall Street Journal and Washington Post have a vested interest in this country to not rock any boats and not tell any stories that would shatter the power structure, and the Hughes story would shatter it and blow it wide open if it were really told the way it should be told. There are two characters I'll be mentioning probably for weeks to come, maybe through the year, involved with the Kennedy assassination, with John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. Their names are in many books that I'll cite as references for you, but they take new meaning now based on new information. And one of them used airplanes those were his private toys to fly back and forth. So the Hughes story always comes into the picture. One of the names is Edgar Eugene Bradley, and the other is Jim Braden. And those of you that have studied the assassinations know those names very well, and they may be new to people who haven't studied them. But the Hughes story and the Bradley-Braden stories are important because, as I say, there are going to be Senate hearings, and if you could send one telegram or 5 letters or 100 letters or 50 letters to members of the Senate and tell them that Mr. Meese, Edwin Meese, should not be the Attorney General for Ronald Reagan until there are full hearings to the relationship of the Nazis up at Hayden Lake in Idaho and in Washington and Oregon to Edgar Eugene Bradley and to Edwin Meese covering up Bradley's extradition when Clay Shaw was arrested and Jim Garrison wanted him for conspiracy to murder the President of the United States. And again, these men link in many ways to the orderly succession of killing at not only John Kennedy, but Martin Luther King and then Robert Kennedy, and that cleared the way for Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan to take over this country in a way that it had never been done before. In the book Legacy of Doubt by Peter Noyes, he mentions just at the end of the book on page 248 how this particular Jim Braden, who was involved in the assassination, was living comfortably at La Costa, that's the Teamsters headquarters, playground down near San Diego, and the San Diego County intelligence officers went into his locker. He was a suspect many times for many things and got off all of them, of course, and they went into the locker and found between $100,000 and $200,000, which Braden claimed was had to do with the Empire Oil and Regency Company. But then it goes on to say one of the investigators who appeared to be knowledgeable about the case said he obtained information that Braden had been given the use of 2 airplanes owned by industrialist Howard Hughes. He speculated that Braden used the planes to carry the cash out of Nevada. So the Hughes story, sometimes he's called Braden, B-R-A-D-E-N, on page 249, and on 248 is Brading. Mr. Noyes uses 2 spellings, but he did use 3 aliases, including his co-worker, Mr. Bradley. So you can have your choice of names. If I call him Braden or Brading, it is the same person. It goes on to say that in the Society columns in San Diego in 1971, he was getting married to somebody. He was married to some very wealthy women and helped his career along those lines. That's another separate story. But he was on his honeymoon. This is like the 3rd wife now, and he was going to have residences at Lake San Marcos in Mexico City and in Spain in 1971. And of course, in Spain, 71, and from the 50s on, was the home headquarters of our Central Intelligence Agency and their offices with Otto Skorzeny of the Odessa Nazi Network, and Skorzeny links up to the Nazis up in Idaho, as I mentioned once before, through Mr. Erlanger of Buffalo, who attends the meetings of the Nazis up near Washington State, in Idaho, near Canadian border, and Skorzeny's headquarters for disseminating Nazi money to set up and further the World Nazi organization, the Fourth Reich. A resurgence has never ended, but went on continuously. He was moving in 1971 to Spain. Now, the Howard Hughes book coming out at this time and the Meese hearings, there's an overlay, as I say, of similarities of characters that weave in and out of this story. Now, Edgar Eugene Bradley is the fellow that Reagan would not extradite, and he should really be put on the carpet for this, because now it links to the very Nazis who have openly said, and I'll read you some more quotes every week maybe, the intention to hang every Jew in the United States and cut their throats, and they have tape cassettes on radio programs telling you how to kill Jews and blacks and get rid of them in this country, every single one of them, even if a few innocent other people die along with it. The fellow writing those tape cassettes and disseminating them on the air is this Colonel William Gale that I wrote about in the Rebel article in 1983 with the Christian Front. And in Legacy of Doubt, it goes on to say, this is another section on page 100. It tells about Mr. Bradley. This is the one that Reagan would not extradite with Mises as legal advisor. Bradley did not hesitate to admit he was in Dallas, Texas, November 22nd, 1983, the day Kennedy was killed. Braden and Bradley were both in Texas, and they worked together in California. Bradley is the employee of the Reverend Carl McIntyre, a spokesman of the extreme right wing. What Legacy of Doubt doesn't have, and maybe Peter Noyes didn't know it, the Torbett document just came out in December of 1970, is that Reverend Carl McIntyre has been identified as the head of the World Council of Christian Churches, the branch of espionage used by Wild Bill Donovan and the OSS as part of their assassination teams. Mr. McIntyre was close to Albert Osborne, a fellow who frequented inside and out of Montego Bay, that worked with the Silver Shirts and the Nazis in the 30s and had youth camps, and Osborne was on a bus going to Mexico City with Lee Harvey Oswald. He ran Osborne, the friend and co-worker with McIntyre and J. Edgar Hoover of Division 5 of FBI, ran that school for assassins that I've talked about many times, and the Warren Commission hearings have information on Albert Osborne, alias John Howard Bowen. Well, McIntyre is in New Jersey, and under him is Mr. Bradley, who is the West Coast representative for McIntyre. McIntyre is close to Clint Murchison in Dallas, Texas, a man who heavily funded the Minutemen, and we'll go back to that later with the sources and the pages on that. And this book, Legacy of Doubt, tells about a key witness against Bradley having to do with the John Kennedy assassination was Dennis Maurer, M-O-W-E-R, the leader of the Southern California branch of the Minutemen. He said Bradley offered him $10,000 to kill John Kennedy in 1960. Now, this is what I wrote. This was a source of information that I used when I wrote my article on the Kennedy assassination of the Minutemen, what happened in 1960. You see, I don't believe for a minute that they planned to kill John Kennedy because of the Bay of Pigs, and I'll cite some more sources I have here for you on that. The minute he got the nomination, he was marked to be murdered. Maurer said, "I hate Kennedy, but not enough to kill him." Well, what is new about this? The fact that Maurer worked for the American Nazi Party, he worked for the Klan, he worked with Philip Earl Scheib, a fellow who stockpiled weapons in the Mojave Desert for this future bloodbath that's going to happen. The important thing about Edgar Eugene Bradley and the Kennedy assassination is written in Legacy of Doubt, and as I say, when that came out, the Torbett document was not known at all, and Noyes says the Garrison plot thickened when the woman said, he's citing a certain witness, she saw Clay Shaw, that's Clay Shaw of the World Trade Center in New Orleans, the man from the OSS that I've talked about that worked with Wild Bill Donovan and Reinhard Gehlen, and the Nazi organization from Nazi Germany. He also is a friend of Hjalmar Schacht and Otto Skorzeny. A woman said that she saw Clay Shaw and Colonel William Gale visit the Bradley house. Now, this is very important. And she said Shaw was identified by Jim Garrison as the co-conspirator in the John Kennedy assassination. Colonel Gale is a frequent candidate for public office in California and identified by the California Attorney General as a right-wing paramilitary activist who led the California Rangers that had a lot in common with the Minutemen. Now, what is new about this information for me, and I know it must be for you, is the relationship of the international Nazis of Otto Skorzeny and Hjalmar Schacht, who frequented the yacht of Aristotle Onassis and then went on, were part of the Permindex assassination hit team from the international level. Clayshaw of New Orleans frequenting the home in Los Angeles of Edgar Eugene Bradley and Reverend Gale. Now, Gale is important because even though I had his name a while back, he's making the news stories now for his influence, founding what is known as the Identity Organization, and now breaking out with the murder of Robert Matthews up in Washington near Puget Sound of November 1984. We got into a different ballgame because when those Nazis surfaced up there that are into the counterfeiting and to the bank robberies and the brink robberies that always were Nazi organizations to get money and raise it in Europe for the Waffen-SS and here for the worldwide Nazi organization. When you get Reverend Gale, who I wrote about working with Charles Willoughby in the Philippines, Willoughby closely associated with Franco and with Mussolini, coming home and joining on the board of Young Americans for Freedom and the John Birch Society. He trained in terrorism and guerrilla warfare and in the OSS with Donovan in India and then in Southeast Asia, and came back to get his terror work going, to do in this country what they did in Germany, which is to kill every Jew in America. Now, in Germany, they didn't have the problem of the blacks that they have here, so the blacks are on the list as well as other Asians in different colors. But what is an international problem of the Odessa, the Hallmark shock, Josef Mengele, Klaus Barbie, Martin Bormann, Walter Rauff, Hans Ulrich Rudel, the whole top Nazi network that is written over and over again in these books, connects directly to the Nazis and the Klan and the murderous gang that want this overthrow of the United States. And what looks like a group of paramilitary kooks has the highest funding and protection of every police department and the FBI and the Justice Department in the United States. If you want to make a copy of this tape, you can buy cassettes, well, they 3 for $1. Get a master tape if you haven't started taping this from the Tape Center in Pacific Grove, and send these tapes and the sheet that goes with it to your various congressmen. Now, Edgar Eugene Bradley was not sent to New Orleans to be investigated by Clayshaw. He was protected by Meese and Reagan. And why were they protecting him? They were protecting Carl McIntyre, who worked with the FBI and still does, and knew all the inroads of the assassination and the setup of Oswald as the patsy. And then directly the contacts go to Clayshaw and William Gale and the identity movement and various operations, then to the Southeast Asia and Taiwan, link to John Singlaub, the World Anti-Communist League, and then back to Kenneth Brown, a soldier of fortune. And we'll go into that a little bit more in a while. Now, this Jim Braden was also in Dallas when Bradley was there. He was at the Dow Tex building. He had changed his name and his license number. He was a suspect at the time of the assassinations, picked up by the sheriff and released. He stayed at the Cabana Hotel, built by the Teamsters, and met with Jack Ruby and Roy Myers of the Pepsi-Cola Company. Pepsi-Cola, the sponsors of the Bottling Convention, 3 days up till the time that Kennedy was killed, that Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday morning of the Bottling Convention. And not only did Richard Nixon speak there, but Lyndon Johnson did. And I have referred to the book, The Cola Wars, and I'll do more. But Jack Ruby and Roy Myers have contacts directly to David Ferry, the co-worker with Clayshaw again, who works with Reverend Gale, and Carlos Marcellos. A lot of this, the researchers we had before, but now with the arrests up north and the investigation, or the superficial investigation of what's going on, more of the pieces are coming together. I knew that when the Torbett document and the World Commerce Corporation tied directly to Mr. Donovan and the OSS and the CIA that was formed 2 years later after the war, that was the first major breakthrough of the links of the Kennedy assassination just at the end of the year that I was so excited about. But now, with the arrest and the following up of the FBI, the convention out of 6 states, to the Nazis, the Minutemen, and the Klan. The Minutemen, for all purposes, went under and changed their name to the Survivalists, which is worse. Those Survivalist magazines are similar to Gun Ho, Soldier of Fortune, and one of the editors up till just about a month ago was David Atlee Phillips, the same fellow involved with the Letellier murder, the man who's been suing Don Freed and harassing him, and involved with CIA in South America and other countries too, the death squads and the coups around the world. He's part of the intelligence network who got into the survivalist magazines. So the Clay Shaw is very important for his links to the international Skorzeny, Hallmarschak, those Nazis, not the Neos, the real hard German Nazis, and also with Mr. McIntyre and Colonel William Gale, and Mr. Bradley and Mr. Braden in Los Angeles, California. As I say, these pieces are all coming together at this time. Now, there was a large article last Sunday, a week ago yesterday, in the San Jose Mercury, a holy war built on hate. Now, this holy war has direct links to the Vatican, to the Inquisition, to the Crusades. This is truly a holy war, and I've cited many times the Knights of Malta, who are on our intelligence advisory group, such as Claire Luce, and there's William Buckley and James Buckley and Vernon Walters and William Casey and James Angleton. The people making the major decisions that are leading us to this holy war do have links back to this group that has gotten out of hand because people like Reagan and Mies suppressed it. Don't forget, Reagan was governor of California when Robert Kennedy was killed, and that also was covered up by the gang. I have approximately 100 articles on this problem up in the northern area, and it's national, international links, and I'll go into detail. This story is written by John Hubner of San Jose Mercury. Neo-Nazis foment a white revolution through terrorism. The neo is only neo to a point. And interestingly enough, in writing about the death camps in the San Jose Mercury, if you have a macabre sense of humor, I happen to have one. There is an article on the survivors of Auschwitz getting together 40 years after members of their family were killed. And many of you saw on television the reunion of the Auschwitz survivors. Well, the San Jose Mercury ran this full page and a half on the Nazis up north who go right to Mengele, Bormann, and the top Nazis around the world. And then there's space at the bottom of the page. So they put death camp survivors. This is supposed to be separate from the Nazis in the United States that want to kill every Jew in the United States, which is them. They think they escaped Auschwitz, and the same day on the same page, these people are talking about killing them. It says death camp survivors celebrate their liberation 40 years ago. And, of course, the location is Oswim, O-S-W-I-E-C-I-M, Poland, Associated Press, January 27th, 1985. Do you remember when the Polish Pope came in? And I cited the background of him from Oswim, that he lived in Krakow and worked at Oswim, and Oswim is and happens to be Auschwitz death camp. If you go back to the broadcast I did, I think the date here, November the 10th, 1978. That seems like a long time ago. 7 years ago, I have a map. Waterwees, the home of John Paul II. Number 2 on the map, Auschwitz, the town of Auschwitz, where the crematory, where the Jews and other people were murdered. They changed the name on the map. It was in the newspaper of his home birthplace and where he works, and it showed at Krakow his home. And number 2 on the map is Auschwim, and I have cited there that Auschwim is Auschwitz, and that Pope worked at Auschwitz, the Polish Pope, in the job of assisting with exterminations in some way. He worked for Solvay Chemical, which is IG Farben. So I don't see that often in the newspaper. They, instead of saying the reunion was at Auschwitz, they said it was Auschwim, and that's exactly what I was trying to tell you a long time ago about this Pope. So while these people, and this is so common. I mean, it's just so pathetic. These people are over there weeping about the loved ones when the chances are they'll see their own family and children, and they have family now, go into the ovens and be killed in the United States. They're all into the computers and the data banks because the money for these robberies is going into phone services and computers that link every Jew in the country and where they work and everything about them. So instead of being vigilant about today, they're so busy crying about yesterday that they can't even read the same page. I wonder how many survivors of Auschwitz or Jewish people reading the San Jose Mercury, just that alone on that page, hearing this broadcast, can tell me if they saw a connection between that article, the gathering, the services at Auschwitz, and the Auschwitz with the Polish Pope, and in the same article about the Aryan nations and Richard Butler. Now, in the San Jose Mercury, that same article, it says Butler, it describes him as a former Lockheed aeronautical engineer in Burbank, California. He became a racist during World War II in India, where he was a U.S. Army captain on loan to the Royal Indian Air Force. Now, I've mentioned before that Mr. Butler, the head of the Aryan nations up in Idaho, worked at Lockheed while he was in Palmdale and in Southern California. And I've mentioned that before, but there's a quotation in the book, The Assassination of Robert Kennedy, that David Emery reached for on Lockheed aircraft in Burbank, and the exact place that Mr. Butler worked is where Thane Cesar worked, the man who murdered Robert Kennedy. The reference is the book, The Assassination of Robert Kennedy by William Turner, and it tells how his co-author, John Christian, tried to locate the gun that Thane Cesar had when he killed Robert Kennedy. On October the 13th, 1972, Christian reached a man to whom Cesar sold that .22 revolver. The Los Angeles Police Department, incidentally, didn't keep the revolver that the security guard from Lockheed had and admitted shooting the night that Robert Kennedy was murdered. Yoder was living in Blue Mountain, Arkansas. He also was an engineer at Lockheed. Before retiring in the fall of '68, Kennedy was murdered in June '68. He knew Cesar casually from the plant. Cesar's job was floating assignments. He worked off limits where only special personnel had access. He was in the area of the CIA-controlled U-2 spy plane facility. Yoder said that a month after Robert Kennedy was murdered, Cesar showed him the revolver, and he offered to buy it to use it in the Ozarks after he retired. Yoder's request, Cesar wrote out a receipt that said, on the day of September the 6th, 1968, I received $15 from Jim Yoder. The item involved is an H&R pistol, serial number 1Y13332, signed Thane Cesar. Cesar sold the gun 3 months after the murder of Robert Kennedy, and often, according to Yoder, he would drag out his security guard uniform that he used in the evening that he guarded Robert Kennedy, and the revolver, the .22, and his .38 pistol. He didn't mention the Robert Kennedy assassination, but he looked a little worried, and he said something about going to the assistance of an officer and firing his gun that night. He said there might be a little problem. Thane Cesar worked in the division of the U-2. Now, Lee Harvey Oswald was in the Soviet Union when the U-2 plane went down. He had worked at the bases in the Philippines and in Japan. And when Gary Powers was brought home for an exchange with Mr. Abel, a Russian spy, and Gary Powers' feat of being down, broke up the peace conference between President Eisenhower and Khrushchev at that crucial moment in June 60. It was supposed to take place. Downing the U-2 prevented the rapprochement of these two world leaders. And when they exchanged Gary Powers for Mr. Abel, the law office of Wild Bill Donovan of the OSS represented Mr. Abel in the exchange. Another gentleman, Donovan, not Wild Bill Donovan, was the lawyer, but he came from the office of Bill Donovan and made the exchange, and they were involved in the CIA U-2 plane, the exchange of the various people and bringing Gary Powers back to this country. So this Mr. Butler, who runs the Aryan Nations, who gets all of his ideas from Reverend William Gale on genocide and murder and killing all the blacks, and as well as his ideas from Mr. Pierce, who worked for the United States Air Force and United Technology, and then went on to the National Nazi Party in Washington, D.C. Richard Butler was a scientist and engineer at Lockheed, and he was there with Thane Cesar at Lockheed at the time that Cesar pulled a gun and Robert Kennedy was assassinated. We'll continue more on this can of worms, this ball of wax, the assassination saga, and the Nazis up north and throughout the United States in about 1 minute. We'll take a 1-minute break and come back for part 2 of this broadcast. Good evening. This is part 2 of broadcast number 687. It's Mae Brussell on KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California, February the 4th, 1985. Again, I'm going very slowly. I usually talk fast because there's so much to put through in 1 hour with you, and I have a lot of material, but I want to get this very clear. Write to various senators or all the senators. There's only 50. If you wanted to write a letter and copy it, basically just change the name Dear So-and-so or Dear Senator and write in the name of the senator and say you don't think that Edwin Meese is fit to be the Attorney General, because there is a lot of information now being put together of the role that he, particularly as a legal advisor to Ronald Reagan, suppressed the assassination teams that were involved with the murder of John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King. And by not allowing Mr. Bradley to go to Jim Garrison to testify or to be cross-examined on why he was in Dallas. I don't say Bradley was in Dealey Plaza. Mr. Braden was in Dealey Plaza at the Dow Tex building. But what he was doing there and his role with Mr. Reverend William Gale and Carl McIntyre and the FBI and the Minutemen and the Nazis involved with this network, and the tentacles, again, going down to Oaxaca, Mexico, through Mr. Bradley and McIntyre. Edwin Meese is not fit to be the Attorney General because the Kennedy assassination is open for all time, and that will lead to the other murders. That is one case where Meese was absolutely involved, and now there's all this new information because they can't say it's old information. Now, to tell you the kind of people I'm talking about or dealing with, I shared some of this before, and I want to emphasize the point. Our time in this country is running out if you don't take these words seriously. These people are not fools. They are engineers like at Lockheed or work at United Technology or for the Air Force or worked as Army officers in the military. These are not kook people just getting together and shooting in the wind. These are people who have been arrested over and over again that got off on every charge and get away literally with murder over and over again and have powerful people in the government always protecting them. Last May 19th, 1983, there was an article about that woman Nellie Babs who talks on a radio station in Kansas City about attacking the blacks and the Jews, the IRS, and other enemies. She doesn't happen to like Catholics personally, but the Catholics figure in a major role in the Knights of Malta with Patrick Frawley, and I could cite, as I did a few of them before, the connecting link to the Vatican connections happens to be Robert Welch of the John Birch Society and H.L. Hunt. As a matter of fact, a researcher obtained for us to share on the air a document that was a letter correspondence involving the Vatican to H.L. Hunt after the 3 Ks were dead, the 2 Kennedys and Martin Luther King, to have millions of dollars in South America to begin youth groups and funding organizations in South America from the Vatican through H.L. Hunt. Some of the right wing may not like the Catholics, but the higher level, the Catholics and the Mormons and the Protestants are working very nicely, and a good hunk of Jews work with them. But in May 1983, out of Kansas City on the radio, and I'm sure she's on there all the time, this is just one incident, KTTL, this is the kind of people we're talking about, and these are the radio tapes made by Mr. William P. Gale and James P. Wickstrom. He's of the Posse Comitatus. Senator Joe McCarthy is his hero. John Hinckley was a member of the Posse Comitatus. This is what goes on the tapes in the nighttime broadcast. The Jews are the children of Satan. They all have to die. They all have to go, and she tells them in one way or another. The radio station suggests that listeners learn techniques of guerrilla warfare, including garroting people in their sleep with lengths of rawhide, of hanging public officials, of cleansing the earth of black beasts, set up roadblocks for ambushes for the impending racial Armageddon. It's sure to come. These broadcasts are prepared by two men, Reverend P. Gale, William P. Gale, the same one that is with Mr. Bradley and Clay Shaw, and the other one is James Wickstrom, who is up in Wisconsin, the head of the Posse Comitatus, and all of them use and share the same material, the Nazis or the hundreds of organizations, the Brotherhood, the Order. It's all identity. Their philosophy is made up by the same Gale who came from the Philippines and the OSS in India and into California to begin the organization of systematically ridding this country of every Jew and every black. Just leave those two and let them have the fringe. Let's not talk about the others right now. That's their immediate goal. There are two men described as evangelists. This is a religious phenomena. They're all reverends. The Mr. Maurer of the Minutemen and the Nazi Party became a minister also. They are reverends. They are evangelists. With extreme right vigilante, they cross over to the Posse Comitatus. They have sessions on guerrilla warfare training in Kansas and other parts of the country. They're all over the country. They were out here in Los Padres Forest, at the Mojave Desert. They're in Kansas, Arkansas, and Alabama and Mississippi and all over the United States. There's training camps where they're stockpiling their weapons. And they cited Gordon Cole, that tax protester who was murdered. He killed two federal marshals in February of 1984, and he was murdered, and he's part of this group. This article on Gale came out in 1984, 1983. The KTTL station, the only country music station within a 60-mile radius, gives this kind of talk at 2, 3, and 4 in the morning. The Babses began broadcasting their tapes in June after a visit by William P. Gale and James Wickstrom, the Posse Comitatus evangelists, and they are Wickstrom has been identified as the National Director for Counterinsurgency for the Posse Comitatus, and the broadcasts are tapes. They pay a fee for Mr. Gale's Identity Church in California, and there's a donor who is not identified or declined to name who pays for these tapes. Now, even though this is written up in the Turner Diary, which is supposed to be a fiction account, the people obeying the instructions of this book are doing along a non-fiction line, and I mentioned that physics professor from Oregon State University working with the Air Force, working with United Technology. And in the novel, again, I've said this before, the organization is to drop atomic weapons on Israel. In the chapter called The Rope, the streets of Los Angeles are lined with hanged bodies of professors and white persons who married blacks, and the murders will be committed by general citizens rather than execution squads. These are the orders or instructions. Now, this kind of thinking goes back again to Mr. Arturkovich, the Andrija, Andrea Arturkovich, who's been in this country for a long time. He was supposed to have been deported in the 1950s. He's down there at Seal Beach in Manhattan Beach. And as I said before, this idea of garroting people, of hanging them from ropes, comes from his actual doing and passing along in Yugoslavia at the time that he was a criminal, knowing that he was responsible for the murder of 770,000, maybe a few more or a few less. Add them, but his method was garroting and hanging by ropes and putting the swords through these people and parading them around the street. So he's been active down there. Don't think that since the 50s that he just sat there and didn't participate in activities and give these people guidance or ideas. They're using exactly the techniques he did. And as I mentioned a few weeks ago on a broadcast, Cardinal Manning, Timothy Manning, the Roman Catholic cardinal in Los Angeles, asked for sympathy, that he wanted you to have compassion for Mr. Arturkovich. He kind of apologized this last week, but he meant compassion. That's his buddy. Now, if you think this isn't going on, go one step further. In the Miami Herald, January 29th, there's a story, Radio Liberty is specializing in anti-Semitism. The official running the Munich-based station is none other than the former Senator James Buckley of New York, who's now president of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Buckley is a Knight of Malta, like his brother, like William Casey and Vernon Walters and Claire Luce, and I'll keep repeating them over and over, James Angleton and Patrick Frawley, and all of these people involved in this dirty mess have been knighted, and that is why, even though the author of the article in the San Jose Mercury doesn't realize it is truly a holy war, he thinks of it as a holy war for those fundamentalist Christians up north. But it's more than that. It links to the Nazis all over the world and the paymasters of the Vatican getting their fingers in it. Now, this is a story that just came out, as I say, this last week by Lars Frick Nelson. This is the way it goes. Did you know that your tax dollars were being used to transmit anti-Semitic broadcasts into the Soviet Union? The New Republic magazine has reported, and the Senate is investigating and confirmed it is true. Radio Liberty, the United States-controlled radio station from Munich that goes into the Soviet Union, is pro-Tsarist, and it's telling people on the air that the person, the assassin of the Tsar, Nicholas II, his prime minister, was a cosmopolitan, a Jew, that it wasn't Russians, that the revolution, that the bind that they're in is the responsibility of the Jews. And they are reading on the air in 1985 the Protocols of the Elders of Zion that were published, these forgeries by Henry Ford, a large supporter of Adolf Hitler, and they're blaming the Jews for the Bolshevik Revolution. This is not the only example, the Miami Herald says, according to listeners and critics of Radio Liberty. The Ukrainian service explained the wartime atrocities against Jews were because so many Jews were Bolsheviks. It didn't say there was a plan to wipe out every Jew, even the banking Jews and the rich Jews and the people in industry and the professionals. It said that the reason Jews had to be killed is that they were Bolsheviks. What is the point of this? The Miami Herald asked. The point is that the Radio Free Europe is anti-Semitic. They want to appeal through bigotry to the anti-communists to push off their problems again on the Jews. They have a tendency to blame the Jews for communism in the Soviet Union, and they're using this on the air. And the critics of Radio Liberty said that the anti-Semitic overtones of many of the broadcasts are not a deliberate policy, but are the result of the U.S. radio station out of control. Radio Liberty is a zoo of petty scores being settled. Well, that apology is an outright lie, because Radio Liberty was set up by Nazi war criminals thick into the murdering, and they're trying to appeal inside the Eastern Bloc again that the Jews got you in the bind. The reason Russia's in control of you now had to do with the Jews. The station says the Munich-based station is nominally under the control of U.S. officials such as James Buckley. The original generation of emigres who fled Russia in the 1920s and 30s were the monarchists, the noble men, and socialists. Many emigres who left during World War II were recruited for Radio Liberty by the CIA and were Nazi collaborators. It does go on and say that in the story. Many are devout Russian Orthodox, and they want to play into the hands of the Soviet Union and say your slavery or your bondage is that because the Jew got you into it. Not that Poland and willingly was used and went along with Adolf Hitler in attacking Russia and invading there and doing horrendous mass murders. I was just reading sections of the book Roosevelt and Hopkins, and how in that book it tells how Stalin wrote and said that we need a buffer, that none of you have ever gone through what we have through 2 wars, and particularly the last war, and that there's no way that they'll ever go through again. It said that this wasn't a war for property that Hitler went through like Attila the Hun. These were barbarians that had nothing at all to do with the way people even wage war, if war is called civilized, which it isn't. nobody ever saw a war like Adolf Hitler conducted. And furthermore, the war that's going to come on this soil by the same people is going to be equal to it. This is your chance now. These are the connections. If you want to move, move. If you want to get in touch with people, get in touch. Get in touch with your congressman and move on these broadcasts that I've been doing the past few weeks and that I'll be doing right into the next year, because there's enough material now on these interconnecting links to do about 25 continuous broadcasts I have right here and I've been working on for the past month. Now, the breakthrough of all of this, a lot of the material I had on Bradley and Braden, the breakthrough came in with that shootout. There were several items that changed the whole picture of the research that I'd done for 21 years. One was the shootout up in Washington and the Nazis at Hayden Lake that broke open the links of Keith Gilbert from the San Quentin Aryan Brotherhood, and Keith Gilbert had an instrumental role in planning the murder of Martin Luther King with the Minutemen in California. He went to jail for planning it and having the weapons, but then King's murder later ties into these very same people. And Richard Butler, the engineer from Lockheed, who worked with Mr. Wheat and Mr. Reverend Gale, who has this meeting on his compound with Manfred Roeder, the top Nazi who's now in jail. His wife attends the conferences, and as I say, Mr. Erlinger, with their links to the entire Galen network down in South America. The shootout in November and the connections of world commerce to Mr. Donovan and the OSS in Clayshaw were two of the big breakthroughs just at the end of the last year, the beginning of this year. And another major breakthrough to the connections of these links of the worldwide Nazis and to Reverend Moon and John Singlaub came during 1983 through the entire year of the links of Western Goals and the Board of Western Goals to the Los Angeles Police Department. And, of course, the Board of Directors of Western Goals is a who's who of military Nazi intelligence operations and their computers into the police departments. The Falwell role in the nomination of the president, of Ronald Reagan, and the surfacing of the new right with the Armageddon philosophy as of the conventions in Dallas again this last August in '83 brought the story of Bradley and Braden to a new place, because it is Falwell's belief, and he says it is sermons and so forth, that every Jew on planet Earth has to burn. This is the tribulation period, and he goes into the glorious second coming of Christ after the earth is rid and scorched of all the Jews and non-believers of Jesus Christ, his Lord. He can't come back till all the Jews are killed, and they will all die. So while this Mr. Pierce is writing the Turner Diary, a guy with military background in the United States, and Mr. Butler from Lockheed and an engineer is running the Aryan nations, the Falwell religious right is running the idea synchronized with them. So what you hear on Kansas City at 2 and 3 in the morning about learning how to garrote and how to poke and kill isn't any different than what Falwell's doing. They're just telling you the methods to do it, and Falwell's telling you it has to happen. And all of these things, just as I said, at the end of 1984 and this month of January, I've spent outlining various books. Now, my library must be filled with books on the Kennedy assassination and the far right, but I'm just going to cite several for you now that are important to this research that I've been outlining, and David Emery has been doing that. We're trying to get this together. There's 9 books and 1 article that I've been working on this past month. This is one reason why I want privacy and time, because I'm making headway with what I wanted to know and what I can share with you that's more important than everyday conversations on the phone. In chronological order, the books that I'm working on that I've cited before that are important to this case, one is the book The John Birch Society in California Politics in 1966 by Brian Stevens. And this has to do with John Birch of the OSS and Wild Bill Donovan of the OSS and Claire Chennault, and the potential of violence, of bringing violence into the streets of America through Robert Welch and the forming of the John Birch Society and its links to Colonel Willoughby and to General Walker and Reverend Billy Hargis and the Christian Crusade, the Christian Front, the Birch Society. This book is an important one that I'm outlining. The next book came out in 1970. As I said, I'm putting them in the chronological order. 1970, The Nomenclature of an Assassination Cabal by David Copeland and Bill Boxley, formerly of the CIA. They're both dead now. They passed away not too long ago. And this goes into Carl McIntyre and Roy Cohn, who's on the board of Western Goals with John Singlaub and that gang. I'm rereading and studying the Torbett document. I spent months outlining it when I got it in 1970. Now I'm going through it again to see it with another eye. Power on the Right by William Turner, 1971. A key book into all the prime people involved and their links and connections to the Minutemen, the Nazi Party, to William Gale, and as I say, now this new story with Gale up north, it takes them up to Idaho. This was written in 71. Mr. Swift, the Reverend Swift, who had the congregation in Palmdale where Identity was formed, and William Gale took over from there. And Mr. Butler, who formed the Aryan Nations, he went up north in 1973. So when Bill Turner's book came out in 71, Richard Butler wasn't up north, and they hadn't started their work there. Another book is The Dallas Conspiracy by Peter Dale Scott. All of these books, incidentally, except maybe the Peter Noyes, it's hard to get. The Legacy of Doubt, maybe we'll have to reprint those and get those sold, and I'll try and see if we can get permission to copy those and get those out to you. Research in Aptos has these books, most of them. The Dallas Conspiracy by Peter Dale Scott has to do with these characters in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, but again, it was completed in 1971 and has no links. Well, it talks about Colonel Charles Willoughby, but none to the national and international Nazi operation. Another small book, 1975, by W.R. Morris. This is on the assassination of John Kennedy, and he fingers Eugene Hale Braden, the fellow that was at the Daltex and at the Cabana Hotel with Jack Ruby and H.L. Hunt, and he names personally two people important in the assassination. Incidentally, he was flown and interviewed by Tom Snyder, NBC's Tomorrow Show, and then the officials were afraid to air it, and of course Snyder was taken off the air, so you don't get much information out of the national network. He fingers two people, John Rousselot and Edwin Walker. Now, Walker has the links to Larry and Volkmar Schmidt in Munich, Germany, the Nazis in Germany, and to Clay Shaw and Young Americans for Freedom, set up by William Buckley, the Knight of Malta, and Robert Morris, the Knight of Malta in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. The gang, the 19 guys that came in from Munich that were excluded from the index of Sylvia Maher's book on the Kennedy assassination. I keep throwing that in because these names didn't appear there. That's why they're not household words to you, even though they were in the 26 volumes of the Warren Commission hearings. John Rousselot was the West Coast representative of the John Birch Society, and he was also instrumental in the career of Ronald Reagan. In fact, he writes, the John Birch Society was instrumental in helping Reagan defeat Edmund Brown. Rousselot has been a supporter of Reagan's for many years, and I mentioned in regard to the Birch Society, John Rousselot. That's why Edwin Meese should not be nominated the Attorney General, because we have to go into the Edwin Walker Rousselot connections to these various characters on the assassination. In 1970, the assassination of Robert Kennedy. Again, a book by Bill Turner, another one by Bill Turner, and it mentions many of these characters and is very important for interconnecting links that now go one more space. This was in 1978. The Cola Wars in 1980 by J. Lewis and Harvey Yasinian. Now, they make no acknowledgement of Nazis, international, domestic, or otherwise. This book is about Pepsi-Cola, part of the World Commerce Corporation, and the connecting links not only to Dallas and Clint Murchison and Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson down there, but then how they spread to South America with J. Peter Grace, and I'll be doing more on that. How one corporation or two, such as Elmer Bobst and his drug company, the fellow behind Richard Nixon's career, or in the Pepsi-Cola Wars, Mr. Kendall, Uncle Elmer and Mr. Kendall, and how they made Richard Nixon the president. John Kennedy was murdered, Robert Kennedy was murdered, Martin Luther King wasn't going to run for president, and then they were home free. Then the book in 1982, The Last Hero, on Wild Bill Donovan. I have read a lot on the CIA. I hadn't spent much time cross-filing and putting into charts or diagrams the importance of the OSS, and suddenly realized in the role of bringing Nazis to this country and the deals they made in Bern, Switzerland, and with John McCloy and in Algeria, putting the Nazis in power there, that so much was going on when the war was winding down with the OSS that I started diagramming this and charting out where these characters were. And then finally, well, maybe I'll have time for a few more things, but I want to just update you now on that article, and I'll be referring to it over and over again, that I wrote on the 20th anniversary of John Kennedy. I'm going to cite certain sentences and then tell you what I've learned in 1 year that's apropos to what we're talking about now. I don't have a page number here to cite it. Okay, this is from the Rebel, and it's in the section under 1960, from page 27 it is. Okay. Otto Skorzeny codenamed his assault on the American soldiers Operation Condor. His father-in-law, Hal Marschak, was the president of Hitler's Reichsbank. And I went on and said Clay Shaw, who was charged by New Orleans Jim Garrison with complicity in the Kennedy assassination, was a close friend of Hal Marschak. What I didn't know that Mr. Erlanger, the name Erlanger from Buffalo, New York, was a close associate and wanted to bring Skorzeny into our Defense Department and see our military installations, and that he works with Richard Butler and the Aryan nations up in Idaho in the Northwest, and with the computers from Dallas and throughout the United States. I didn't know about Richard Butler at that time. Then I went on in 1952, I talked about Otto von Bolschwing of the Gestapo, who worked with the various Nazis in this country, represented Reinhard Gehlen in 1952, Nikolai Malaksa, the Nazi from the Iron Guard, moved to Richard Nixon's office in Whitaker, California, and was close to Otto von Bolschwing. What I didn't know then that I learned this past year and just recently, I had in the files but forgot, that Otto von Bolschwing was close to Wild Bill Donovan in 1939. Before we even entered the war, Hitler had already been into Poland and had taken many of the countries we weren't going into after Pearl Harbor. He was close to Mr. Donovan and the corporate heads, but particularly Donovan, who was forming the OSS just at that time. William Stevenson had come from Great Britain to Washington, D.C. to form the OSS, and Otto von Bolschwing was working with Donovan at that time. Now, I wrote under the 1960 elections, continuing Richard Nixon versus John Kennedy, that before the elections of 1960, a group within the Christian right planned to kill John Kennedy in Van Nuys, California. They're members of the anti-Castro Cubans, the Minutemen, and homegrown Nazis. Some were sought by Jim Garrison following the arrest of Clay Shaw. Garrison wanted the extradition of Edgar Eugene Bradley, and Governor Reagan refused to sign for it. What I didn't put in the article at the time was that Edwin Meese, the future Attorney General, was the man who prohibited the extradition of Bradley as a legal advisor. Now, all the time I was writing the article, Bill Turner was here saying, that's too long, and he was cutting out the very pertinent parts, even though he's written 2 marvelous books on this subject, and I'll go into that, what happened here again for some of you, but it's a complicated story, but I couldn't put all the things in I wanted, and I got more than they wanted me to put in, but Larry Flynt wanted it in. Now, what I didn't realize was that Edwin Meese would be nominated for the Attorney General, a very important part. I said the leader of one of these groups, the Christian Defense League, was the Reverend William P. Gale, and I mentioned his links in the Philippines during the war. I didn't know that Gale is the man making cassettes and distributing information to kill every Jew and every black in the United States. I was writing about the Kennedy assassination and the Nazis and their links, but Reverend Gale in 1985, this is 1 year since the article was completed, is making tapes and has the intention and the goal, working with engineers, scientists from the Defense Department and police departments and the FBI, for the process of getting rid of every Jew and every black in America. I wrote about the Christian Defense League contacts with Captain Robert K. Brown from Fort Benning, Georgia, who had mercenary teams of anti-Castro Cubans similar to Skorzeny's teams. What I didn't realize when I wrote about him and Mitchell Werbel and the Silencers was that Brown's Soldier of Fortune was started by John Singlaub of Western Goals, World Anti-Communist League, with Skorzeny's Nazis in South Central America and Southeast Asia and Egypt. That Brown is directly linked to the Nazis, and John Singlaub in the year since I wrote that, I have gotten from some great researchers the links of Singlaub and Brown and Soldier of Fortune that I didn't have then. And I mentioned the Silencers and the Bay of Pigs and Mitchell Werbel. Now, I wrote about the Permindex operation and the plans of J. Edgar Hoover working with Division 5 and Clay Shaw to assassinate John Kennedy, and the links to Otto Skorzeny and the Borghese family, the black nobility, with their death squads and planned coups in Europe for fascist regimes. When I wrote that, I was not aware, or if I had the book that Clay Shaw met with Reverend Gale in California, Mr. Bradley, I did not connect until just recently, of course. The Gale who wants to do all these murders and drop atomic bombs, wipe out Israel and wipe out the Jews, is directly linked to Bradley, who Reagan wouldn't extradite, and to Clay Shaw and Hallmar Schacht and all the Nazis. So in the year that I wrote that article, I'm extending it now to get a book out to put in all these pieces, and that's one of the things I really am anxious to do. If you want to send for the bibliography of this broadcast, send a self-addressed stamped envelope and just say you want the sheet that goes with broadcast number 687, Mae Brussell, P.O. Box 22511, Carmel 93922. I'll send that to you so that you will be more knowledgeable and can write or call the various senators and tell them that Edwin Meese and Ronald Reagan covered this up, but Meese was the legal advisor, and they link to the Nazis in Idaho, and that he should not be the Attorney General, and let this all be cleared up. This is Mae Brussell, and I'll be back with you next week to continue some more on this subject.